How's it going, everybody? So, I'm sure that you guys have noticed that recently I've been back on the ball making content. It's good to be back, and the response has been absolutely incredible. But apparently, during the past couple of months that I've been on this hiatus, YouTube got up to some shenanigans. They rolled out a new automatic dubbing feature with the use of AI. And yeah, it's apparently pretty bad. Dubbing as in, instead of you hearing my voice that I'm talking to you with right now, it's an AI voice talking to you in a different language. And the worst part about this is they didn't even inform creators that they were doing this. And it's not even a feature that you as a viewer can turn off. So for the past month, I've been uploading videos and had no idea that a large portion of my audience were getting terribly dubbed versions of my content. Because it automatically does this depending on the location of where in the world you're watching from. And so I started getting comments on each one of my videos talking about this terrible AI voice, and I'm like, what is everybody even talking about? What's happening? And then I looked into it and found this bizarre choice that was made by YouTube. And from what I've gathered, it works okay for the most part until it tries to translate scientific terms, which we use a lot around here. So my guess is that the AI picks up that I'm speaking English, so it goes, okay, I'm going to translate from English to these 10 different languages. Then I say a scientific term, which is mostly in Greek or Latin, or in the case of last week's video, in Polish, and apparently that gives the AI brainworms. So once I found out about this, for no other reason other than all of you telling me, because YouTube wasn't going to, I quickly went into the settings and fixed the problem, where automatic dubbing was turned on for some reason. However, there was still a problem, because I guess there's no way to turn that off in the videos that I've already uploaded. Meaning that going forward, this problem will be fixed. But the past 3 videos are still borked. And that made me mad, because it would have really hurt the channel to pull those 3 videos down. So I came up with the idea for this video. This is a supercut of all the videos that I made in January of 2025. Free from the terrible AI-generated dubbing that has been recently plaguing us. Although, I won't lie to you, I kinda wanna see a poorly dubbed German Tim.
Wieso willst du der dreckige Depp sein?
Oh god. I am so sorry to everyone that I have unknowingly exposed to that, but I am not sorry to everyone that I just did that to on purpose. German Tim now lives rent-free in your head forever.
Ich buchstabier's dir mal, okay?
So the problem should be fixed going forward. Thank you to everyone for letting me know, and consider this video a gift to my international audience. But I also know that a lot of you like my longer compilation videos, so everybody can enjoy this as a little ASMR.
Ich will jetzt ins Bett!
Enjoy the show. Stay tuned to the end of the video for an important announcement regarding the future of Paleo Analysis. 1993. If you were a fan of dinosaurs, it was a big year. The year that brought paleontology and our modern understanding of ancient life from the Mesozoic era into the public eye. People knew about dinosaurs before this, but the general public still viewed them as big, dumb, slow, lumbering lizards. You know, kind of like the amazing butt babies at the Crystal Palace in London. Which, not knocking that, because that is absolutely on my bucket list to go see. That's assuming they're not destroyed by any angry British people before I get to go. But by the 90s, there were some actual specific dinosaurs that people knew by name. Things like Triceratops, Stegosaurus, what we at the time called Brontosaurus, and of course T-Rex. And if you were a nerd, you might have known of a few others like Allosaurus and Ankylosaurus. But that was about as far as most people's knowledge went. But in that fateful year, a new dinosaur would skyrocket into popularity and become many people's favorite dinosaur. And it would do so by being the villain of a movie. A little movie that you may have heard of, which I know, it's trendy among paleontologists to pick this movie apart, especially because of this one in particular species. Because, yes, The velociraptor depicted in Jurassic Park is way off from the real animal that we call velociraptor. In truth, they actually changed the name of another raptor called Deinonychus into velociraptor. And there's actually a few reasons why they did this. It's actually not even as simple as velociraptor is just a scarier name. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. If you want to know more about that whole discussion, check out this video by Clint's Reptiles. He gets all into it. And maybe one day I will talk about my feelings about the Jurassic Park franchise as a whole. But what I wanted to point out was before Jurassic Park, most people didn't even know what a raptor was. And like most of the famous dinosaurs that we think of, or that I just listed a moment ago, they're not a single species. They're actually an entire family of dinosaurs, the dromaeosaurs. Most of these were fleet-footed, agile hunters that, as far as macro-predatory dinosaurs were concerned, were pretty small, most species measuring under 3 meters. But in 1993, a new species was described that would break the mold of what we thought we knew about dromaeosaurs. The largest member of this family that we know of, and one of my all-time favorite dinosaurs, Utahraptor. This is an animal that almost seems too good to be true in a lot of ways. It's like saying, what if a raptor was trying to be a giant apex predator like Allosaurus? And to really get my head around the idea of this amazing animal, I reached out to my friend Nathan over at the Cackling Crow Productions. And he made me this absolutely exquisite full-size replica of a Utahraptor skull. Because even though everyone's familiar with the claw, which, don't get me wrong, is undeniably impressive, this was the real business end of the animal. At 23 inches long, this is a full-size model. And if you were to run into me recently at a couple of different events that I've been to, you may have already seen this beast. But I want to tell you that you don't have to be a paleontologist or even a science communicator to own a piece like this for yourself. Now, I do own some fossils, but I am of the belief that I, as a person, have no business owning a real dinosaur skull. I have used casts and replicas for educational presentations long before I had this YouTube channel. But up until recently, I had a very difficult time getting a hold of large dinosaur casts. But then I met Nathan, and his work absolutely blew my mind. Now, buying a replica of a dinosaur skull is never going to be cheap, especially at full scale like this. But I will tell you, as someone who has been in the market for fossil casts for more than 20 years, I have never seen them go for as affordable as Nathan offers. This isn't even so much a sponsorship as it is me promoting a friend who I feel deserves the recognition for the work that he's doing. Everything he makes is 100% hand painted. He painted this. And if you want an amazing model like this, but you don't have the budget or the room for a full-size Utahraptor or ankylosaur, because yeah, I got an ankylosaur, then you can order any of the different pieces that he creates scaled to whatever size you want. If you want to check out the Cackling Crow and possibly order a handmade piece of prehistory, I will leave a link to his website and socials below. But now, it's time to check out one of my favorite dinosaurs. Now, I said before that this animal was first described in 1993, but it was actually discovered technically way before that. The first remains were actually found way back in 1975 by Jim Jensen, near Moab, Utah. However, the remains were way too fragmentary to really make any concrete identifications from them. All that was really clear was that it was the remains of a large theropod, so this find would go largely ignored for about 16 years. That is, until October 1991. When a large claw was found by Carl Lamone. This, along with further remains found by Jim Kirkland the same year in the Cedar Mountain Formation, gave us more of an idea of what kind of animal they were looking at. Kirkland recognized the claw as a trademark of what was, at the time, a little-known group of small meat-eating dinosaurs, or at least little known to the public. In the world of paleontology, raptors had helped scientists learn that dinosaurs were active and, in many cases, fast-moving animals rather than the sluggish reptiles that we once thought they were. This revolution in our understanding about dinosaurs started in 1964 with John Ostrom's discovery of Deinonychus. Ostrom was the first to propose that some dinosaurs may have been endothermic or warm-blooded. So going back to 1991, Kirkland knew he had some kind of dromaeosaur, but there was one major inconsistency. The claw was massive, especially compared to every other raptor found at the time, and the other remains suggested a much more robust animal than any other like it. This was a huge raptor, and its discovery prompted a great deal more study in the already highly prolific fossil site of the Cedar Mountain Formation. And then, finally in 1993, Kirkland and his colleagues chose to name this beast Utahraptor ostromesi, the species name honoring John Ostrom for his contribution to our modern understanding of raptors and dinosaurs as a whole. However, it should be noted that it was very nearly named something else. For you see, in the early 90s, a certain film director had taken a big interest in raptors, and he was actually helping to fund the research that led to this discovery being published. So, as it turns out, Utahraptor ostromesi was almost named Utahraptor Spielbergi. Yes, really. And it is very possible that although the velociraptors in Jurassic Park was primarily based on Deinonychus, the fact is that the Jurassic Park raptors are still somewhat larger than Deinonychus was in life. Not as drastic as to compare Velociraptor from the movies with Velociraptor, the real animal, but it was still bigger than Deinonychus. And with Steven Spielberg having this inside information about an as of that point unpublicized larger raptor, it is possible or even probable that this did draw some inspiration to the animals that we saw in the film. But even though we knew these remains were from a raptor that was larger than any known at the time, we still didn't know exactly how big, which could explain why the movie raptors are bigger than the real Deinonychus, way bigger than Velociraptor, but still considerably smaller than what ended up being the real Utahraptor. Nobody could have imagined the scope of this nightmare fuel of an animal. Not even a Hollywood director. It was a raptor for sure, but it was different from every other raptor. But why was it so big? Why did this family of small gracile predators become a giant in one instance? Well, to figure that out, we would have to look at the environment that Utahraptor lived in. And luckily, the Cedar Mountain Formation has not only yielded even more remains of Utahraptor since 1993, but the fossils of many other species that lived in Utah 139 million years ago. Dromaeosaurs generally are seen as small to medium-sized predators. Hunters of small prey if they were solitary, or if they were social, like they've been depicted in media, then they may have been able to take down larger animals. But we are still talking about a group of animals that didn't exceed 100 pounds in most cases. And that was okay. They were filling the niche of small, fleet-footed predator, which was a good spot to be in, because contrary to what many people think, not everything in the Mesozoic era was gigantic. There was plenty to eat in the featherweight class.
I see what you did there.
And quite frankly, there was way too much competition for the spot of apex predator. But every once in a while in nature, you see an exception to what many of an animal's close relatives are doing. And 139 million years ago in early Cretaceous Utah, that seems to be the case. The fossils of the Cedar Mountain Formation give us a pretty good picture of the area as well as many of the animals that lived at this place in time. Most of this area was covered in patchy conifer forests separated by semi-arid regions, with rivers and lakes dotting the landscape, and there were abundant dinosaurs throughout this region. One of the most common was the iguanodons, two different species, as well as a species of armored nodosaur called Gastonia, which may have been one of the most dangerous members of its family, with its sharp spikes that adorned its back and got substantially larger at the shoulders and again at the base of the tail. Along the sides of the animal, they were almost blade-like, making this one of the most well-defended herbivores in the region. There was a basal therizinosaur called Utahraptor, which stood about 2 meters tall, along with other smaller dinosaurs, one species of mammal, and several fish species in the lakes and rivers. But the largest animals to call this place home were the sauropods. Specifically, one of the last relatives of Brachiosaurus, the 15-meter, 10-ton Sidarosaurus. So we have a pretty good idea of what the world was like in Utah 139 million years ago. But you may have noticed that there was something missing from this roster. None of the famous large predatory theropods were present here. Tyrannosaurs were still on the rise, but they weren't the masters of the northern hemisphere just yet. No allosaurids, no Carcharodontosaurids, no abelisaurids, no megalosaurids, and the closest spinosaurid lived clear on the other side of the planet. This lack of a top predator in an ecosystem teeming with potential prey was just the opportunity a dromaeosaur needed to try its hand at being the top predator. But in order to do that, it would have to drastically reinvent what it means to be a raptor. Utahraptor is the largest species of dromaeosaur that we know of, but there were other members of this family that did get big. 2 later raptors called Achillobator and Dicynodont. Both got between 5 and 6 meters long, or around 15 to 18 feet, and also about 2 meters in height. But the thing is, both of these animals appear to have been built like large dromaeosaurs. They were thin and gracile, built for speed. But Utahraptor was built different. It was heavier and stockier than the other members of its family. While most of the other raptors were built like cheetahs, Utahraptor was more of a tiger. Achillobator got close to this more robust shape, but it wasn't on the same level as Utahraptor. And really, we're still doing a lot of guesswork when it comes to Dicynodont, since there's only really been some teeth and some very fragmentary remains like some limb bones and a few vertebrae ever found. So, enough to tell that there was a large raptor, but not much else. Before the discovery of these other 2 large raptors, it was thought that Utahraptor was this larger size because it was an older species, a more primitive basal animal, and that the raptors were getting smaller as time went on, and they actually descended from larger-bodied theropods. But the truth is, all 3 of these raptors probably evolved this larger body size independently. Now, in the case of both Dicynodont and Achillobator, they got big, but both were not the top theropod in their environment. Both had to compete with tyrannosaurs. In fact, Dicynodont, which lived in the late Cretaceous Hell Creek, had to contend with the mightiest tyrannosaur, T-Rex. So they were always playing second fiddle to something, but not Utahraptor. As far as we could tell, in early Cretaceous Utah, this animal was king. And with this more heavily built frame weighing about half a ton, it is believed that this animal used a very different hunting strategy to the other dromaeosaurs. Most raptors were pursuit predators, running their prey down and weakening it, so similarly to wolves. With their lighter bodies, they wouldn't expend as much energy running as their larger-bodied prey. But with how big Utahraptor was, this strategy would not work. It is thought that instead, these animals were ambush hunters, more similarly to other large theropods or big cats today. And it's also hard to say for sure whether or not this animal hunted in packs. There is some evidence to suggest this, but it may actually just be circumstantial. In 2001, 10 years after the discovery of that first claw, Jim Kirkland and some grad students discovered a Utahraptor bone eroding out of the desert. Little did they know at the time, but this was literally the tip of the iceberg, or the tip of the sandstone block, because they ended up pulling out a 9-ton chunk of sediment that contained the bones of at least 7 individual Utahraptors, including 1 adult, 4 juveniles, and a hatchling. It appears that these animals died together, and I know that this seems like a smoking gun for proof of pack behavior, But I do want to present both sides of this debate. For you see, these 7 Utahraptors were not alone. They were found alongside at least one iguanodon. And sandstone like this is specifically formed from hardening mud. So what we think happened here is an iguanodon became trapped in the mud and either was already dead or close to death when it was discovered by these Utahraptors. And in this situation, predators did what predators do and took advantage of the easy meal. However, this easy meal turned out to be a death trap. The raptors went to feed on the iguanodon and inevitably got stuck themselves. So this was kind of a La Brea tar pit situation. But what we can't say for sure is whether or not these Utahraptors were traveling together as a pack when they found the iguanodon, or if the scent of a dead dinosaur or the calls of a dying dinosaur attracted several individual Utahraptors from all around. We see this type of behavior in animals like Komodo dragons, crocodiles, and heck, even scavenging birds like vultures, where they don't necessarily live in a family group, but they will gather together to feed. But regardless, this find tells a very interesting story about a very bad day for a number of animals in eastern Utah 139 million years ago. So Utahraptor became this large in response to an opening in its environment. As far as we know, for around 5 million years, it was unchallenged as the largest carnivore in the region, a position that no other dromaeosaur that we know of was able to claim throughout the entire Cretaceous period. Whether it actually hunted in packs or would occasionally just gather with others of its kind around kills is unknown, but regardless, they appear to have the run of the place. But I wouldn't say that they were exactly untouchable. As far as large predatory theropods go, they were still technically on the smaller side. If anything, this could be further evidence that these animals hunted in packs, making up for their comparatively smaller frame that would struggle to tackle larger prey alone. Regardless though, the sauropods were probably not on the menu unless one was found already dead. And Gastonia would have probably been a tall order in most cases as well. It would take a desperate Utahraptor to try to face down such a well-armored opponent. More than likely, their preferred large prey would have been those iguanodons. Especially the smaller species, Hippodraco, which was about the same size as an adult Utahraptor. There was also smaller prey available as well. Besides the small reptiles and mammals, we see the fossils of numerous different fish, turtles, and even freshwater hybodont sharks throughout this rock formation. This could, if nothing else, give us an answer to what younger Utahraptors were feeding on, if in fact they did not live in family groups. And we see a possible adaptation for an at least somewhat piscivorous lifestyle. You see, if you look at the bottom jaw of Utahraptor, you'll notice that the front of the jaw curves outward. This is definitely a curious feature that has not been fully studied in regards to what uses it could have had. But one theory suggests that a jaw arrangement like this, which is unique among dromaeosaurs but present in other dinosaurs, may be an adaptation for catching and holding on to difficult to grip prey like fish. Now, this does not diminish Utahraptor as a terrestrial apex predator, but in my opinion, with the added context of its environment, this shows us that this animal was perfectly adapted to the world it called home. We're pretty sure that iguanodons were migratory animals, so it would make sense for them to be prepared to hunt other sorts of prey if their preferred food was not available. This strategy seems to have worked well from 139 to 134 million years ago, when Utahraptor seems to disappear from the fossil record. We don't know exactly why it disappeared, but if I were to venture a guess, I would say that it may have been the result of a constantly changing landscape. You see, throughout the Cretaceous period, the continents of the northern hemisphere were constantly being divided by inland seas like the Western Interior Seaway and the Bering Strait. This, along with the presence of mountain ranges, would isolate populations of dinosaurs for millions of years at a time. And it seems that one of these times of isolation is when Utahraptor rose to become the top predator. But because this was constantly in flux, eventually there was going to be an opening for competition to come through. With the evolving tyrannosaurs in the west, and the carcharodontosaurs like Acrocanthosaurus to the south, it was only a matter of time before this giant dromaeosaur was outclassed. And like I said before, by comparison to a lot of these true giant predators, Utahraptor was still fairly small. Acrocanthosaurus weighed around 12 times as much as Utahraptor, so there would have been no contest if the two ever came face to face. Now, even though the oldest remains that we know of for Acrocanthosaurus are around 10 million years after the last Utahraptor, we know its ancestors were already larger, because these guys were bred sauropod killers from South America. But a lot of this is all speculative. The truth is, we don't know for sure why Utahraptor disappeared 134 million years ago, or even if this really was the end of their story at all. With how sparse the remains of Utahraptor are, it's not impossible to say that as the Tyrannosaurs took over, these larger-bodied raptors went back to filling a more mid-sized predator role that they had done in the past, meaning that Utahraptor could be a descendant of Utahraptor. We don't think that this is the case.
Hold on. Also, there's that whole thing about Utahraptor possibly not being an actual thing, which, yeah, maybe, we don't know. But also, there's definitely been enough fossil evidence found to where we know for sure that there had to have been a larger species of raptor in Hell Creek at the end of the Cretaceous. Maybe it wasn't Utahraptor, but there was definitely something there.
Thank you, Tim. I know that if one of us didn't say that, I would get at least 300 comments all telling me about that one simple fact. But honestly, that's something that I really love doing. I love speculating and trying to think of the possibilities of how things could have played out based on the evidence that we have at the time. Because that's what a lot of paleontology is. Piecing together the story of life from whatever clues the Earth has managed to preserve. Here's another example. We don't actually have any direct evidence that Utahraptor had feathers, but we do have concrete evidence that other dromaeosaurs both before and after Utahraptor definitely did. And we have zero evidence proving that any species of this family definitely did not have feathers, like we see in the skin imprints of dinosaurs like hadrosaurs. So, until evidence comes to prove otherwise, it makes sense to assume that all raptors, even the big ones, did have feathers.
Personally, I don't understand people saying that feathers make them less scary anyway. I feel like anyone who thinks that needs to have a staring contest with a harpy eagle.
I feel like the public just got super used to the depiction of raptors as scaly because, like I said at the start of the video, most people didn't even know what a raptor was until Jurassic Park.
It doesn't matter, man. Birds are scary. Harpies have to be the scariest bird that ever existed.
No, not really. And actually, that reminds me about a video that I've been meaning to make for like over a year. In fact, there's a lot of videos that I've been meaning to make for a long time. And yes, I know, the next History of the Earth is due out. But if you have been following me on Twitter or Instagram, or even occasionally seeing my community tab posts here, you know that things have not been great in 2024. And looking back, most of 2023 sucked too. I'm not going to get into the details because it's involving my personal life. But I've already said what I needed to say. I have for a long time been trying to force myself to do things that everyone has been demanding of me, and reluctant to do what ideas I get passionate about. And I'm sorry, but I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not in a place right now where I will be able to make content consistently if I'm forcing myself to do things when I'm not feeling it. I will still be doing the History of the Earth series, but you have to understand those videos are by far the most work and research intensive. I do not have a team. I am still a single person doing this. The way I see it, I can continue to do things how I've been doing them, and maybe upload 10 times per year, or I can go back to making videos about whatever I feel passionate about in the moment, and you will all be getting a lot more content for it. So, to answer your question, when is the next History of the Earth coming out? When it's ready. So many of you have been hugely supportive of me through what has probably been the worst year of my life. And I shouldn't be saying that about the year that we hit 200,000 subscribers. I want to thank all 205,000 of you for sticking with me, and I want to tell you that better days are coming. I never thought I would have a channel grow to this size, and I hope that this is just the beginning for Paleo Analysis. I want to thank Nathan from the Cackling Crow for providing me with this awesome reconstruction of a Utahraptor skull. Because of him, I now have a skull replica from one of my all-time favorite dinosaurs. And I had an excuse to tell you all why it is one of my favorite dinosaurs. If you would like to possibly order a piece from him, I will leave a link to his socials in the description. Alright, I want to thank you all again for sticking with me and for watching this video. Here's to a better 2025. Have a good one, everybody. Happy New Year. Today I have something special planned. Paleontology has been a passion of mine for my entire life, and having this channel has given me the opportunity to make educating people about the history of life on Earth my full-time career. However, there's one particular project that I've wanted to do on Paleo Analysis for a while now. I've always wanted to go out and film out on a dig and document the adventure for all of you to enjoy. And in May of 2024, I was finally able to record enough to make that a reality. The White River Formation is obviously situated around the White River, which is a tributary of the Missouri River. This over 26,000 kilometer or 10,000 mile river system cuts across Nebraska and South Dakota, but the badlands that surround it are exposed in an area that spans Wyoming and Colorado as well. This expansive site has layers that have been dated to the Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, and Pliocene, giving scientists a truly outstanding amount of insight for how this region of the Midwest has changed throughout the Cenozoic era, as well as many of the animals that lived here. And I love going to places where the Earth can truly tell us a story, and White River is one of those places. So gather around and let me tell you all the story of my adventures out in the White River Badlands in 2024, as well as the story of some of the creatures that we found along the way. This is actually my fourth time headed out to the White River Badlands. And by comparison to most of the team, I'm actually somewhat of a novice in the field. Most of them have between 15 and 30 years of experience digging in this formation in particular, and I've come to find their knowledge and insight invaluable. Now, I won't lay a ton of introductions on you all at once, but this trip is primarily put on by Mike and Sina Searle, two of the, honest-to-God, most important people in my life. Mike is somebody who I actually refer to as my mentor, and he's actually made some major contributions to the science. Maybe I'll get into that one day, but for now, just know that these are really awesome people who are largely how I became who I am today, as well as the reason why I'm able to go out and hunt in the White River Badlands at all. Now, as I said, this formation covers a huge span of time, but where we go in northwestern Nebraska is focused from around 34 to around 30 million years ago. So the area of study here is mostly Oligocene with some of the late Eocene in the lower layers, just to give you kind of a mental map of what we're looking at. This is an incredibly interesting time to be exploring. It was when the tropical forests of the Eocene were just starting to recede, and the world started a cooling and drying trend that would continue all the way until we arrive at the Ice Age. But Oligocene Earth was still a long way off from that. The majority of the team all made their way from central Florida all the way to northwestern Nebraska like we do every year. Many of us fly if we can, but some do have to drive with a trailer to be able to bring back the fossils that we find. So just getting out there is about a 1900 mile drive for the team. And once we arrive, we prepare for an adventure for around 10 days, pretty far outside of what most people would call civilization. The population of Crawford, Nebraska, where we stay, is around 800 people. The town is best known for its historic Fort Robinson, as well as the Fighting Mammoths fossil exhibit, a rather famous find of two bull Columbian mammoths that had gotten into a fight and in their rage had gotten stuck together and eventually died. And this year, we actually got to stay at Fort Robinson as our base camp. And this actually allowed me to have a little bit of internet connection. Emphasis on little bit of internet connection. So during the month of May last year, instead of uploading any long-form content, I instead uploaded 15 shorts covering the 9 days that we spent on this adventure. Why shorts, you ask? Well, even though there was some internet reception, and it was definitely better than where we've stayed previous years, it still wasn't great internet connection. And considering I spent half of the month in a place where cows outnumber humans, we were all lucky I was able to upload anything at all. So I did that kind of to give everybody an update on where I was when I was out in the middle of nowhere. However, it's very clear to me from the numbers that not a lot of my subscribers actually got to see those shorts. Which, you know, makes sense. After all, you're all here primarily for long-form content. But these little clips did give some very nice boots-on-the-ground perspective of the daily goings-on of our adventure out in White River, as well as all of the amazing fossils that we found along the way. So I think the best way to do this is going to be, I'm going to talk about each day of the trip, and then I'll show the shorts in this video to kind of give the field cam perspective of how the day went. And plus, I know it'll be new content to most of you, because most of you didn't see the shorts. So after setting up the first day and getting our supplies for the trip at the closest large town of Shadron, we headed out to our first spot, the Titanothere Beds. The Titanothere Beds is a site that has been extremely good to us in the past. As the name suggests, this location has been a hotbed of Titanothere remains. And it's one of those animals that's very presence can tell us a lot about the exact layer that we're working with. Because around the time of the late Eocene into the early Oligocene, the Titanotheres were going extinct. The species we see here, Megacerops, are estimated to have died out around 33.9 million years ago, meaning that they only existed for around 100,000 years in the layers that we go hunting in. So, as a general rule, if we see Titanothere remains, that means that we are in the oldest rock layers in the region. Megacerops is also one of the most impressive animals that we find here. Many of the other animals are comparatively smaller, but this thing weighed almost 4 tons, close to the size of a white rhinoceros. But with their high shoulder hump, they would have been quite a bit taller at over 8 feet tall. They are actually similar to rhinos in many ways, but in all actuality, they're part of a separate branch of the family that includes rhinos, tapirs, and horses. The Parasidactyls, or odd-toed ungulates. One of the main physical differences between a true rhino and a Titanothere is the fact that the horn is actually part of the skull and comprised of bone instead of the keratin horn that modern rhinos have today. Ironically, these guys actually probably looked more like rhinos than the real ones that lived alongside during the end of the Eocene and the beginning of the Oligocene. But more on them later. I found not a whole lot on this first day. A few vertebrae from an Oreodont and some partly eroded tortoise shells from the Stylemys tortoise. These are probably the 2 most common animals that we find remains of here at White River. Stylemys is a tortoise that in many ways is similar to the gopher tortoise of the southeastern United States, only if gopher tortoises could reach up to the size of a Galapagos tortoise. We actually find them in a wide range of sizes, and actually the most common size is around the same size as a gopher tortoise. The biggest challenge is that when these shells get exposed, the clock is now working against them. These animals remained in the ground for 34 million years, but once erosion exposes them to the sun, wind, and rain, we only have maybe, at best, a year or 2 before they break apart and are lost forever. By far, my best find of the day was this Titanothere incisor. It was complete with a full root, and even though it came out in 5 pieces, that will actually be an easy fix once I get it back home. But beyond that, the day was pretty slow. Nobody found anything worth putting in a plaster jacket, so we went back to base and prepped for day 2.
These are the White River Badlands. The adventure begins on day 1. What you got, Mike? First fossil of the trip? Oh yeah?
Enamel.
tortoise, a stylemes. This probably, you couldn't even see it last year when we were here. This will slowly start to erode away. Every time I come out here, I seriously contemplate whether or not I want to go home. Look at this place.
So, the unfortunate fact about hunting for fossils in this region is that we will always get rained or snowed out a few days every single year. We shoot for either the beginning of May or the beginning of October to go out because those are the best two windows of opportunity to be able to get as much hunting done as possible. But even then, we will inevitably have a few days that it's not worth going out. We did not expect this to happen on day 2, but fortunately there are a lot of cool things in the area for us to check out on our off days. And where we are in Nebraska, we're actually only like 20 or 30 miles south of the South Dakota border. So we oftentimes end up going out there at least one day out of the year. And in 2024, we actually got to hit two of the most amazing natural history museums in the entire state. As we head into the Black Hills, we first stop at the Mammoth site in Hot Springs, South Dakota. And these are my favorite types of museums. There are a handful of sites that are so valuable to the science that they end up literally building an entire research facility around the fossil site. The 61 mammoths uncovered at this site are dated to around 20,000 years ago, give or take. And in addition to them, they found several other animals like camels, antelope, ox, and one giant short-faced bear. The reason why all of these animals died here is because 20,000 years ago, this site was a sinkhole. It filled with water, and the bank remained extremely steep. And the hole was deep enough that if a full-grown mammoth fell in when it was trying to get a drink, it would not be able to escape. This is something that mammoths would have likely taken measures to avoid most of the time. After all, mammoths were every bit as intelligent as modern elephants. However, during times of drought, they would have been forced to take greater risks to get at what was likely the only constant source of water, a risk that clearly did not pan out for many individuals. We know that this is probably how the site was formed because these mammoths didn't die all at once. Different individuals would fall in thousands of years apart, and thus appearing in different layers of the site. Following our time here, we headed to Black Hills Institute in Hill City, an absolutely amazing dinosaur museum owned and operated by Pete Larson. The majority of the focus of this museum is Cretaceous dinosaurs collected in the Hell Creek Formation, but he does have some other fossils as well, including an impressive collection from the White River Formation. And I actually have a video on the channel showing a tour by Pete himself back in 2021, so you can get the full feel of the museum if you want to check that out. But one thing that wasn't in the 2021 video was this baby Triceratops. And something interesting about that is that he did actually show this to us back in 2021, but it wasn't on display. So basically, he took us behind the scenes and showed it to us, but asked us not to take any pictures and keep it under wraps. So it was just really cool to go back and actually see it on display, since that meant that I can now show it to all of you. But anyway, on to our next adventure.
It is a beautiful day in northwest Nebraska. However, unfortunately, we will not be hunting today. So although it currently looks like this outside, by 11 a.m., we're looking at like an 80% chance of rain. However, today is not a total loss because there's a lot of things that we like to do while we're out here in Nebraska. So instead of doing any fossil hunting today, we decided to head over to South Dakota and check out the Hot Springs Mammoth site. In this amazing location, they've uncovered no less than 60 Columbian and woolly mammoths, as well as a multitude of other animals. Work is ongoing to this day, and they actually work all year long because they've actually built a museum around the actual site itself. But we're not done yet. Black Hills Institute. Utahraptor skull, and right here, that's the tooth that I found yesterday.
So after getting rained out yesterday and not finding much the day before, the team was eager to get back out and find something good. So we headed on down the road. Unfortunately, we may have been a little bit too eager. And when selecting which truck we were going to take into the Badlands, the people whose vehicle I got in failed to mention that their truck was not a four-wheel drive. Yeah, pro tip, if you ever find yourself driving through the back roads of the White River Formation after a heavy rainstorm, only attempt this with a vehicle with four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. If you overlook this tip, chances are you will not be able to make it to wherever it is that you're going. In fact, in these conditions, the sediment is challenging to even walk on. But after several rounds of pulling the truck out just to make it down the road, we finally made it back out into the Badlands. But because we spent nearly 2.5 hours getting out there, we decided to go to an area that was a little less demanding. So we found ourselves at the Flats. But although this area is less physically demanding, that doesn't mean it's less lucrative. A lot of carnivore remains have been found in this stretch of the Badlands over the years, including 2 different species of nimravids, or false saber-toothed cats, and the year before, a complete hyenodon jawbone. And on this trip, within the first hour, Mike actually found a piece of a skull from something that we initially weren't sure of. At first, we thought it could have been from a Hoplophonius, the larger of the 2 nimravids. But under closer inspection, I realized that this was no cat. This was the piece of a jaw from an Archaeotherium, a hoofed predator from the family of Entelodonts. These animals were omnivores, and were originally thought to be closely related to pigs, which is where the name hell pig came from. But now we know that they're actually more like predatory land hippos than pigs, making them arguably even more intimidating. And as you can imagine, this find made Mike hyper-focus on that area for most of the afternoon, because whether it was a Hoplophonius or an Archaeotherium, it was definitely a find worth further investigation. So I left him to that, and I started poking around another hill. There I started finding more vertebrae, toe bones, and hoof cores from an Oreodont. And now seems like a good time to explain these guys, even though they're actually somewhat hard to explain. I've heard people say that these animals were similar to deer, or pigs, or sheep and goats, but in truth, this is an animal from a family of artiodactyls that has no modern descendants today. These are actually a holdover from the Eocene when the world was warmer, more humid, and covered in forests. And during the Oligocene, that was starting to change. But at this point in the early Oligocene, they were still doing quite well, which is why their remains are so common out here. Unfortunately, despite this seeming like a good spot, after poking around for a bit, it was clear that this little guy had already been lost to time. Whatever was left had probably been exposed, and these crumbs were all that remained. These fossils that have been preserved in the sediment for 32 million years will erode away in 6 months if they're not removed from the elements. And honestly, that was kind of the same sight that we were plagued by for the rest of the day. Finding washes where what was left of a tortoise or an Oreodont had been washed away, and picking up the pieces that were worth keeping. And Mike never did find any more of that Archaeotherium either.
The weather currently looks gorgeous. One thing you have to know about this area of the country is that the weather can change exponentially very, very quickly. I have been out here before and I have been snowed on, rained on, hailed on, and baked under 100-degree sun all in one day. So we're stuck for the 3rd time today. But I did just see this little cool set of tracks. So here we've got some deer hoof prints going off in that direction, and right here with it, there's some paw prints coming in the same direction. So there could have been a story going on right here. Possibly a coyote following a deer. And this all had to have happened today because this all got rained on yesterday, which is why it looks like this. Hardships, we finally made it. These will be our Badlands for today. So we've been here all of 20 minutes and Mike Searle just found this. So I've been checking out this hill, pulling a bunch of little bits of bone out. And among them, I found these 5 little tiny hoof cores. So here you can see this pile. This one has pretty much started to erode away. This is mostly a tortoise, but in amongst it, I did find that Triassic tooth.
After getting skunked on day 3, we decided to go somewhere that had a little bit firmer ground. In fact, the spot that we picked next is notoriously the firmest ground that we contend with in this entire area of Badlands. Concrete Hill, an area famous to our team for the amazing finds that it has produced, and infamous for how back-breakingly difficult it is to remove them. Anything substantial like a skull or, God forbid, a skeleton would take days to get out, and it will probably require the use of some heavy power tools to remove, which we would then have to go into town to rent. Because keep in mind, we don't have access to things like forklifts and front-end loaders like you see people using to remove dinosaur bones. We have one four-wheeler, and everything else runs on manpower. That is whatever manpower is left after several hours of hiking and digging in the Badlands. But why is Concrete Hill so solid? Well, more than likely, it's actually for the same reason why it happens to have so many animals locked inside it. It's believed that this area was once a river floodplain. Water will inevitably attract an abundance of life, as well as harden into impenetrable sandstone once it dries out, especially when you consider the amount of ash in the soil of the White River Formation. So we call this Concrete Hill because it basically is concrete. And normally I wouldn't even poke around in this area unless I walked past a big eye socket looking back at me. But I didn't want to go back to base empty-handed yet again. So after looking around 2 of the holes that Mike had dug in years past, I struck out on my own. And then I saw 2 ribs eroding out of another hill. And at the size that they were, I was confident that I knew what they were from. A hornless species of rhinoceros called Subhyrachodon. This is, low-key, one of my favorite animals out here. Despite being a relative of modern rhinos, Subhyrachodon was very different from what you would think of as a rhino. It was about the size of a large tapir, and had no horn at all. And unlike both rhinos and tapirs, it had longer legs and seemed to be well adapted for running, which is where the nickname running rhino comes from. This is actually the larger of the 2 rhino species found in this formation. But unfortunately, even though this was not actually on Concrete Hill, it was still the same impenetrable sediment as Concrete Hill. So I dug as much of the ribs out that I could and probed around a little bit to see if there was anything else near the surface that I could find, which there wasn't. So I wrapped the 2 ribs in aluminum foil and called it a day. But I will absolutely be checking back in that spot the next time that I'm in this location.
I'll be beating Badlands out of these boots for a month, but they'll be getting Badlands out of their wheel wells for about 6 months. Cooler day out in the Badlands today. It looks like they're on an expedition to Antarctica. Oh, if that weather turns bad, it's gonna be nasty. That spot right there is where a Titanotheres skull was found. But this hill is kind of a spot that people kind of dread finding things. All right, but now we're gonna get off this hill and try to find something that's not gonna take us a week to get out of the ground. Of course, we find a piece of a rhino rib. It's not on a concrete hill, but it's on a spot that has very similar sediment. And there's another one. Oh. That spot right there is where a Titanotheres skull was found. You see right there, there's some bone coming out. Is this the spot, or is that over there the spot where you got the pig? Okay. So, in addition to the Titanotheres, which was over there on the opposite side, Mike Searle, who's been coming out here for 27 years, found an Archaeotherium skull right here. And he comes back to check every year, but he kind of hopes he doesn't see anything good. When they found this pig, they literally had to go into town and rent a concrete saw to cut it out, and they spent 4 days working this one spot. And there's some more bone coming out right there. The leg bone. This is just impenetrable.
So on day 5, we got rained out again. It was starting to look bad when we were headed back the day before, and then it basically rained non-stop through the night. And the cloud cover in the morning suggested that it probably wasn't going to get any better as the day went on. So we took this opportunity to head over to the local elementary school and talk to the kids about some of the animals that used to live here. In years past, we would actually bring the 4th grade class out into the field with us and do some White River hunting themselves. But unfortunately, this year we couldn't do that, because rain. But we were still able to go and give a presentation. The 4th grade class actually has fossils that they have found over the years on display. Finds like an Oreodont, the tiny 3-toed horse Mesohippus, and by far the most astounding find, a Dinictus, another Nimravid or false saber-toothed cat. Not as large as Hoplophonius, maybe around the size of an ocelot or perhaps closer to a caracal. And they not only found the remains of a Dinictus, but they found a skull with one of the sabers still intact. Usually, when the kids find something, we'll help them get it out of the ground, plaster it, and then take it back home with us to Florida. Then we have their finds prepped, made display worthy, put on a nice little plaque, and then we bring it back to them. So every year, we come back with new fossils for the 4th grade teacher to put on display of the animals that used to call Northwest Nebraska home.
It's an ugly day out today. Oh well, we weren't going hunting anyway. Today we will be fulfilling our duty to the community.
These are some of the fossils that have been found by some of the kids in previous years.
So I'm gonna do a little bit of tumbleweed shopping. That's too big. The best tumbleweeds that you can get are the ones that are small and compact and really full. I don't know how long this fence line's gonna do it for me. I think this one will do nicely. I'm gonna take this opportunity to check out this little local rock shop. It's actually the one where I got my Hyenodont skull a while back.
So, it turns out that there was so much rain between the evening of day 4 and throughout day 5 that day 6 was not going to work for hunting either. I swear this is going to get better. The back roads to the Badlands needed more time to dry, so no hunting on this day. But fortunately, we did have one more place to check out. In my opinion, one of the most fascinating stops that we make on the Fossil Nerd Expedition, the Agate Fossil Beds National Monument. Driving only 35 miles away from where we hunt, we're also traveling around 10 million years forward in time. This site is truly incredible. And after hunting the Oligocene Badlands so much, I especially appreciate this museum. Many of the animals that are found at Agate represent the direct descendants of the animals that we've been hunting on this trip. And we see the direct effects of evolution over time. Although the Oreodonts still exist at this point, they're a great deal less common than we see in the Oligocene. As I said, in the previous 15 million years or so, the world has been changing in a way that did not favor these low browsers. And going into the Miocene, that trend continued. In their place, the most common herbivore are camels called Stenomylus, along with a small dog-sized rhino called Monoceros. These animals likely descended from the Poborotherium and the running rhinos. The bear dog genus Dicynodont still existed at this point, and in fact grew to around 3 times the size of the specimens that we find in the Oligocene, reaching around the size of a wolf. And one group of animals that unfortunately did not make it to 19 million years ago were the Nimravids. Their extinction would leave a gap in the ecosystem that eventually would be filled by the Barbarophilids and then again by both modern and saber-toothed cats. But none of these animals existed yet in North America. At this time, there were no cats of any type. But that niche would not go unfilled. The role of cat-like predator would instead be filled by a mustelid, Megalictus, a badger the size of a jaguar. These two animals would have been the undisputed top predators of the agate grasslands, but there were a few animals in an entirely different weight class altogether. The largest herbivore was a Calicothere, Moropus, a browser that fed on high leaves with their clawed front limbs similarly to a ground sloth. But despite their appearance, these animals were parasitactyls, related to rhinos and horses. And the true king of the early Miocene prairie was another familiar face, the children of the menace of the Oligocene, an Entelodont. But these animals took all the qualities that made Archaeotherium a terror and turned it up to 11. They went from the 500-pound Archaeotherium to the 1,500-pound Deodon. This was an omnivorous, cloven-hooved monster the size of a bison. Just like in the region that we hunt, Agate Springs shows us a complete food web that existed in the first half of the Miocene in the Midwest of North America. This is a site that I love going to visit every chance I get, and I fully intend to make a video getting more in depth on this site in the future. This is the perfect type of site to be the subject of a Lost Worlds video. But for now, it's time to head back to base and prepare to do some more hunting. But before that can happen, we were in for a very surprising evening.
The clouds are finally beginning to part, but the ground is still quite wet. So the Badlands are not going to be a good idea today. So today, we're going to be going to Agate Springs. In order to get to Agate Springs, you have to go way out. And there it is, that little building right there. Here at Agate Springs, we see the descendants of a lot of the animals that we hunt at the White River Formation, as well as some animals that weren't represented at all there. This is where all of those fossils were found.
So if you remember back to May 2024, there was a powerful geomagnetic storm that took place, the strongest in apparently over 2 decades. This caused auroras to be visible as far south as North Florida, Texas, and Alabama, and led to everybody in the US running to the internet and being like, "Look at this photograph!" Well, now it's my turn to do that. Where we were, it was absolutely phenomenal. These pictures were taken around midnight, and where we were so far out in the middle of nowhere that there was almost no lights. And I mean, we didn't plan for this. I mean, how could you? But we could not have been in a better place to experience this phenomenon. Unfortunately, I didn't know that on day 7 we were going to be going to the Highlands. This is definitely the most precarious location where we hunt. Fissures cut deep into the ground, some of them over 100 feet down. And actually, on my second time out here, I very nearly went down one of those fissures. I was walking on a patch of ground that I swear I was walking on the exact same spot 6 months before. And I guess the summer had been particularly dry that year, because when I stepped on that spot, the ground literally crumbled under my feet. I slid down a slope about 30 feet and managed to stop myself with my boot on one of these Badlands shrubs. And it was a good thing too, because there was literally a hole that went straight down that was so deep that I could not see the bottom from where I was positioned. So yeah, I could have died that day. I could have literally become part of the fossil record. And ever since then, I obviously take extra care whenever I'm traversing the highlands. But the hunt must go on, and this time I would find a few remains from some of the smallest animals that we find here. The first being a little piece of jawbone from a leptomeryx. This little cat-sized animal may be called a dawn deer, but they were not true deer. True cervids would not evolve until the Miocene. These animals were another one of those early basal artiodactyls. But the next animal that I found was exactly what its name suggests that it is. Paleolagus, the White River Badlands rabbit. The lagomorph order of mammals have existed ever since all the way back in the Paleocene around 58 million years ago. But unfortunately, rabbit bones are so lightweight and fragile that most of the time when we find Paleolagus fossils, they look like this. That was about all I came up with on day 7. This was starting to get old, and I wasn't the only one suffering with this. Everybody was having a slow year this year. But luckily, in the days to come, luck was gonna start to turn around for me. Sorta.
After all the rain that we've been facing for the past couple of days, and then the sky being set on fire last night, we are finally looking at some absolutely gorgeous fossil hunting conditions. This is probably one of the most precarious places that we hunt. I actually almost died here once. Here's a jawbone from the smallest ungulate that we find here at the White River Badlands, the Leptomeryx, or dawn deer. So it may not look like a whole lot. But if you look right here, this is a partial lagomorph skull. I'm probably just gonna pop this out and tinfoil it real quick. And boom. All wrapped up, ready to go. Just in case anybody's wondering, this is how you become part of the fossil record. There are so many ways to die here.
At the start of day 8, the weather was still good, and there was nothing but clear skies on the forecast. 70 degrees Fahrenheit and sunny. The ground had dried up, and that meant it was time to hunt. It was a good thing too, because we only had a few days left of digging time available. So we headed out to one of the Fossil Nerd Adventure team's favorite spots in the Badlands, the Plateau. This is a location where in the past, the team found a set of footprints from a running rhino. So we were all hopeful, because this trip had been largely a bust so far. We found mostly bits and pieces of smaller animals, and even the rhino ribs that I found were able to be transported in a foil jacket. Almost nobody had used any plaster on this trip. I think at this point we had like one jacket in the trailer to bring back. And with so little time left, we were eager to find something good. And as we all fanned out across the plateau, first I found another small fossil. One that was originally not clear exactly what it was in the moment, but it turned out to be a jawbone from another one of those Oreodonts. A nice little find, but I wanted something more substantial. And next, Sina found a jawbone from the small three-toed horse Mesohippus, a little smaller and more fleet-footed than the Oreodonts. This is one of the animals whose descendants would become more prevalent as the climate got drier, and it became more beneficial to be a grazer. But I wanted to find something myself. So I kept trekking until I found a little tiny bit of bone eroding out of the ground. It didn't seem like much at first, but there was definitely something there. I asked for another opinion, so one of the others from the team came and told me that they thought it was part of a pelvis. And as I started to expose a little bit more, it became clear that from the size of it, it was going to need plaster. So I stopped doing uncovering and I started digging around it, as you're supposed to do. But after about an hour of digging down and around it, I found something that was quite shocking. Teeth. This was not a pelvis, this was a skull. And from what I could see, the bottom jaw was there too. Now I could only see the incisors in the front, and it was unclear which animal it belonged to. We thought it may have either been an Oreodont or the smaller of the two rhino species, Hyrachodon. Similar to the other running rhino, Subhyrachodon, but only about the size of a sheep. But as we realized what I may have found here, another problem started to come up. From over the hills, a dark cloud was descending fast on the Badlands, and this created a very tricky situation. As I said before, weather in the Badlands can change in a heartbeat, but the way that I had this fossil dug up, it would have been a very bad idea to cover it up and leave it. A large amount of rain would have caused the entire thing to collapse, and as the clouds rolled in, the temperature started to drop. The wind started to pick up, and around this point I had 3 other people rush to come help me dig this thing out of the ground as quickly as possible. Because after about 20 minutes, the temperature was down to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And with the moisture in the air and it getting so much colder so fast, it made it impossible for plaster to set and harden. So we were left with only one option, a last-minute field decision that I did not want to make, but I literally had no other choice. I took a roll of duct tape, and I started wrapping this chunk of sediment, making a duct tape jacket around the fossil so we could rush it out of the field. The plan was, once we get back to base, I would put an additional layer of plaster on top of the tape so it would be safe for the trip home. And luckily, this decision seemed to have worked out. With the duct tape jacket keeping it as secure as I could, we managed to get it in a net stretcher and get it walked out of the Badlands, just as it started to hail on us. So we managed to get out with at least one good fossil that day. But because of the quick and drastic change in the weather, we were only able to hunt on the plateau for about half a day. And with how large of an area that spot is, everyone was adamant to have a second chance the following day.
Today's hunting grounds is an area that our team calls the plateau. An area that you can see the spots where fossils have already been taken out of the ground here. So here we're either looking at the underside of the jaw or a piece of rib. Can't even tell what it belongs to yet. Could be an Oreodont or a rhino or something like that. And survey says we have a jawbone. You can see right there some teeth poking out. So I finally got the jaw out, and we're like 80-90% sure that it's probably Oreodont. Sina Searle managed to find this piece of a mesohippus jaw. So I'm having a good day today. I saw this little bit of bone exposed, and now I've dug out this, and we're thinking it's the pelvis of something, or at least part of the pelvis. This might actually be jacket worthy. I saw this little bit of bone exposed, and now I've dug out this, and we're thinking it's the pelvis of something, or at least part of the pelvis. So after doing a little bit of poking around, it turns out that this pelvis has teeth. So it looks like I've got a skull here.
Just cover it right now.
Desperate times called for desperate measures. We had 4 people digging on it, 2 people would carry it out. It's the skull of something.
Day 9 was going to be our last day of officially hunting, and luckily the storm that ran us out the day before didn't stay long enough to make the roads impassable. So off we went on our final hunt. I didn't expect to find anything on this day because I had just found something the day before, but it actually didn't take me very long to come across something. A Stylemys tortoise. One that had just started to get exposed. And that's what you want. You want the ones that are just beginning to come out of the ground so you can see it and you know it's there, but it hasn't, done that. Now, I wasn't the only person who saw it, but the others all decided to let me have it, since they all wanted to find something more rare. But especially after all the excitement of the day before, finding a tortoise only 15 minutes into the hunt was good enough for me. So I sat down and started digging. Mike told me that from what he could see of the shell, he thought it would probably be about a foot long. So about the size of an average gopher tortoise. And I figured it would take maybe about 3 or 4 hours to get out of the ground. But me and Mike were both very wrong. The more I dug, the more I found. And the shell just kept going further into the rock. And after about 6 hours, it became very, very clear that we had underestimated the size of this shell. Like I said before, Stylemys range widely in size, and although it was thought to be around 12 inches long, it turned out to be closer to 20 inches long. So more like a large adult sulcata than a gopher tortoise. And because of this, by 5 p.m. I had managed to get plaster on it, but it was not dry enough to flip and get out of the Badlands. Not to mention, it did not want to budge. So that meant that we had no choice but to cover it up and come back for it the next day. Something that I honestly really hated doing, but anytime that you have something big, it being a multi-day project is unavoidable. So unfortunately, this stubborn tortoise was going to have to spend one more night out in the Badlands.
Another beautiful day for fossil hunting. We came back out to the plateau today, and I found a tortoise. This one's just starting to erode out, so now I'm going to have to dig around it. This will probably be most of the day's project. Okay, this is going to be a bigger turtle than I thought, because there's this piece right here. I didn't know whether it would be just a piece that fell off or if that's actually the perimeter of the shell. Oh boy, that's a big jacket. Gonna get up that hill, that four-wheeler right there, so at least it's not a super long distance. So what do you think?
It'll be close to 200 pounds. And it's 200 pounds.
Oh,
12 inches.
I was told 12 inches at the beginning of the day. It is not 12 inches.
No, it's not. It's about 20, maybe.
The final day of this trip is normally not spent hunting. We usually take this time to cap any of our jackets, start packing up everything, and prepping for the 1,800-mile trip home. But today, all those things had to be done, along with me putting a full jacket on that skull from 2 days ago, and we had to go get that tortoise, because there was no way that I was going to leave that out here until next year. So we rushed out to make the final extraction of the trip. And this time, we brought a crowbar tool with us to help us get this stubborn fossil out of the ground. Now, as I said before, I know that people digging up dinosaur bones deal with much larger jackets than this. But we do not have the kind of equipment at our disposal that they have. We have rock hammers, a crowbar, a four-wheeler, some sticks, and a net. And our mitts. So getting a 200-pound chunk of the earth to break away is sometimes quite the undertaking. But after a little more coercing, at long last, the tortoise was broken free from its 32-million-year-old tomb, and after removing as much of the weight from the underside as possible, it was time to walk it out of the Badlands, and head back to base for the final time in 2024.
Our final day going out to the Badlands. We have a lot of work to do. For one thing, that tortoise that defeated us yesterday has got to come out of the ground today, as well as me needing to put some plaster on my skull from the other day.
Yeah, today we're not asking. Today you're coming out. Well, I didn't bring it with me the first time.
Ooh, it moved.
There we go. Victory! It's time to bid these Badlands farewell. Until next year.
This place is truly magical to me. Every time I come out here, it is an adventure that will stick with me for the rest of my life. We talk about the amazing discoveries in paleontology all the time on this channel, but I can tell you that the animals that you actually get to go out into the field and find their remains yourself like I just did here will always hold a special place in your heart. It's just different when you get to be the one who finds and digs up the remains of an individual organism that has been gone for millions upon millions of years, and manage to preserve this piece of the Earth's memory before it turns into dust. I want to thank you for joining me on this little adventure. I know that this is a little different from my normal content, but if you enjoyed this, I would really appreciate you liking the video. And leave a comment telling me which of the animals from the White River Formation is your favorite. As I said, I go back to the Badlands every year, so if this does well, maybe these videos can become a yearly tradition. I will tell you, I already intend on doing a Lost Worlds video about the ecosystem of White River, along with the one about Agate Springs. But until our next adventure, have a good one, everybody. How's it going, everybody? So in the last episode of this little mini-series that we're doing, the history of the Earth, the beasts of the Triassic, we talked about how in the middle Triassic, there was an extreme shift in the climate that set the stage for a strange archosaur known as Hyperodapodon, and how we see them explode in numbers so great that they represent between 70 and 80% of the animal specimens found from Triassic fossil beds from around that time, and all across Pangaea. This impressive distribution is something that we hadn't seen since Lystrosaurus, a Dicynodont that exploded in population in the very beginning of the Triassic 18 million years before. And in the early Triassic video, we talked about how despite Lystro's abundance in the first million years of the Triassic, they quickly dropped off as new predators and competitors arrived to challenge them. Around a million years after the start of the Triassic, Lystrosaurus was gone, which is sad because this animal survived the greatest mass extinction that ever happened on this planet. However, there would be a legacy. The story of the clade of Dicynodonts wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. And I received several comments in that video asking if Lystrosaurus was so common, why didn't it diversify following the early Triassic? Well, as it turns out, even though Lystrosaurus was extinct, it did have many close relatives that continued on. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The Dicynodonts as a whole are very much considered a forgotten lineage today. But throughout the history of their existence on Earth, these synapsids were major players in their environment. Specifically during the Triassic, these were the most successful stem mammals, bar none. There were a few cynodonts that got a little bit larger, like Diodemodon, but for the most part, these were the most abundant synapsid in the Triassic period. They filled many keystone roles all over the world during the Permian. At this time, most were small burrowing herbivores that fed on roots and tubers.
I hate roots and tubers.
Shut up, Tim Tim. Don't forget, 16% of the audience wants less of or none of you.
Yes, but that means that 84% of the audience loves me.
Yeah, well, questionable decisions of 185,000 people aside, let's move on. We talked about several of these creatures during the Permian episodes, and I also made a dedicated video to the ironically named Bulbasaurus. But this was the most common body type among the Permian Dicynodonts. A few got larger, but during the Permian, the role of browsers was kind of taken up by reptiles like Scutosaurus. In fact, Lystrosaurus was on the upper end of Permian Dicynodonts as far as size goes, at about the size of a small pig. But this body was clearly built to be a survivor. The Dicynodonts and the Cynodonts were the only two clades of therapsids to see any kind of success following the Great Dying. Lystrosaurus rose and fell within the first million years, but this sprawling browser body type would become the new standard in the Triassic, very likely finally being able to get larger with the absence of animals like Scutosaurus, meaning they basically evolved convergently with the reptiles that preceded them. And if you look at the skeleton, it's actually pretty clear. Their skulls are pretty different, but besides that, the skeleton of Scutosaurus looks very similar to, say, Placerius, which is a Triassic Dicynodont. Taking advantage of this vacant niche was the key to success at this time. Most of the Triassic Dicynodonts, like Placerius and Wadiosaurus, were between the size of a sheep and a cow, but they diversified to a remarkable degree during the Triassic, and took over as one of the most common large herbivores throughout most of this time. And one particular species at the end of the Triassic would break this mold. The most impressive Dicynodont that we know of at any time throughout Earth's history was actually only described in 2019, but the fossils were actually excavated between 2006 and 2014. You know how it goes, we talk about this all the time. The reason why it took nearly 10 years to fully understand what this animal was is because it didn't fit our obvious interpretation of Dicynodonts. The bones were massive, and from these we could determine that the animal that they found was around 4.5 meters or 15 feet long, and 2.6 meters or 8.5 feet tall, and weighing around 7 tons. Putting this animal at around the size of an Asian elephant. So until a very obviously Dicynodont skull was found, it was assumed that this creature was a different type of animal, because based on our understanding at the time, they didn't ever get this big. As I said before, Dicynodonts were at this time predominantly low browsers or other species that continued to live that burrowing lifestyle. And ever since a Carnian Pluvial episode that we talked about in the Hyperodapodon video, a different kind of large herbivore stepped into this role of high browsers, the early sauropodomorphs. That's right everyone, in the back half of the Triassic, the synapsids and the other archosaurs of the past were finally sharing the world with the very first true dinosaurs. For a long time, it was actually thought that the Dicynodonts were actually outcompeted by the sauropodomorphs. But now, it's more widely thought that what was actually happening was a case of niche partitioning, when different groups of animals that live in a similar way or eat similar things specialize just enough to differentiate from their competition. So basically, the sauropodomorphs got bigger and the Dicynodonts stayed relatively smaller, allowing both groups of herbivores to live alongside each other without directly competing. So before the skull was found, this beast was originally thought to be a species of high-browsing dinosaur. But it turned out to be a massive Dicynodont, named Lysowicia after the town in Poland near where it was found. But if the Dicynodonts everywhere else were getting settled into the niche of being a medium-sized low browser, why did Lysowicia get so big? In order to answer that question, we have to look at the environment that Lysowicia called home. And as luck would have it, we actually have a lot of information to paint this picture. This region of Poland was, at that time, a warm, marshy conifer forest with a climate similar to the Florida Everglades. As expected, this type of habitat had an abundance of animal life, particularly well adapted to a wetland habitat. Lobe-finned fish, amphibians like the Timnospondylus, proto-dinosaurs like Silosaurus, and small early pterosaurs being the most common small animals in the region. But what's interesting is there were no other Dicynodonts found in late Triassic Poland. The only other member of the synapsid lineage was a tiny early mammal, and there was something else missing that makes Lysowicia's great size make a little bit more sense. There have been no large sauropodomorphs found at this site, and this left an opportunity that other Dicynodonts around the world didn't have. It could get big without the competition of dinosaurs. dinosaurs. And besides getting big, this animal also had a lot of other features that made it unique among Dicynodonts. For one thing, its legs were completely different. Unlike its relatives, which had legs that splayed out from their body, with Lissavicia, all 4 legs were directly under the animal, which makes sense. It makes it more efficient for travel, especially when animals get a great deal larger. So instead of walking similar to a lizard, its gait was probably more similar to rhinos, elephants, or sauropods. Another one of the features that, before the skull was found, led scientists to think that this was a sauropodomorph. And oh, that skull. This was an impressive beast. Undeniably a Dicynodont, but still very unique among them. It had a massive crest on the back of the skull that attached to the neck and gave this animal a ton of power behind it, and a powerful beak for cutting through and crushing vegetation. It was like a living bulldozer. Now, most Dicynodonts are very much toothless, with the only exception being a pair of tusks in the top jaw. However, in Lissavicia and its closest relative, Placerius, we see the tusks get replaced by a 3-pointed beak. This may have been an adaptation for having an easier time shearing vegetation, while the tusks were more useful to its ancestors, which were doing more rooting and burrowing. But everything about this animal suggests that it had left that life far behind, and this was further proven by the discovery of coprolites. Lots and lots of coprolites. And for those who don't know, coprolites is fossilized poop. And as much as people scoff at the idea of fossilized feces, this can tell us even more about an animal than the bones ever could. Because with this, we could figure out exactly what these animals were eating. And it appears that these behemoths were literally eating trees. Much in the same way that we see elephants push down entire trees today, Lissavicia would topple over conifers and use its powerful beak to rip off branches and shear off bark, basically eating the entire thing. Fibrous plants like wood tend to be very easy to detect in coprolites, so this was very clear. But even though the sauropodomorphs did not seem to share this environment with the giant Dicynodont, it did have to contend with dinosaurs. Well, sorta. We think anyway. If you remember back like 2 years ago, we talked about a particularly mysterious Triassic animal, a predator named after an old legend of a dragon called Smock, and it was found in the same clay pit as Lissavicia. And I'll leave a link up above for you to check out that video and learn everything about Smock. But basically, it might be a dinosaur, or it might be a different branch of the archosaurs that evolved bipedalism, which we think was happening with different groups of archosaurs like Postosuchus. So its exact lineage is unclear, but what we do know is that this appears to have been the apex predator of the Triassic Polish swamps. And even the largest animal here was not immune to this nightmare. At least, not when they were young. We know this because fossils of Lissavicia have been found with marks consistent with predation. And the only animal that we know of in this ecosystem that was big enough to leave bite marks of this size was Smock. However, all of the signs of predation have been found exclusively on juvenile individuals. So by the evidence, it seems that at a certain point, Lissavicia grew to be too much for even Smock to handle. However, babies were still vulnerable, and when looking at the growth rings in the bones of these animals, we can see that they had a very fast rate of growth. This is a common feature among very large animals, especially when they have pressure from predators as babies that would struggle to handle them as adults. This is another thing that Lissavicia shares with sauropods. And really, that's one of the main reasons why I felt that this video was important to the History of the Earth series. More so than Lissavicia itself, Dicynodonts as a whole may have had an unspoken impact on the future of another group of vertebrates. Let me explain. Because if they were not sharing the world with animals that were already established low browsers, sauropodomorphs might have never adapted to become high browsers, and thus may have never started down the path that would lead to them becoming the largest land animals that ever lived. So to answer everybody's question, they did diversify after Lystrosaurus. And indirectly, they would have a hand in the creation of some of the most spectacular animals the world has ever seen. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like. And comment below and tell me which other Triassic animals you think should get a little extra attention before we move on. So subscribe if you haven't yet, and share this video with anyone who enjoys paleo content. Have a good one, everybody.